Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Marlene, and your committee for doing this symposium on an annual basis, and this year to have also justice and accountability added to commemorate or to actually celebrate 25 years of its existence. I wish that more educational institutions like yours would take an example and do the same thing as you're doing. Because if nothing more, awareness of what is happening even today in this world is very, very important. And what I can say and understate the effect that Professor Cutler address moved me to the point where I am emotionally overcome. I particularly want to thank Professor Cutler for making a few kind remarks about the contribution of the survivor community worldwide, including the one in Montreal. And to do my little bit, I am very honored to be part of this process and be able to speak to you today. The topic that I will be speaking on is anti-Semitism, and I have named my presentation A Lifelong Witness to Anti-Semitism. These are not incidents of anti-Semitism that I read about, that I heard about. These are anti-Semitic acts that I witnessed. Honorable Professor Cutler, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. In the spring of 1936, at the age of 5, I was confronted with my first taste of ugly anti-Semitism. I was on a visit with my mother to the village of Grodzisk in eastern Poland, where she was born, and my grandparents were the owners of a general store. Upon arriving in the streets where the store was located, my mother and I were frightened by the loud and unruly crowd that was carrying signs and were yelling slogans. The signs, I was told, had the message, "Do not buy in Jewish stores." And the verbal messages were anti-Jewish derogatory chants. And since I was born and lived in a town with 15,000 inhabitants only 20 kilometers away, where the Jewish community at times was 50% of the total, I never before witnessed such a frightening and shameful spectacle. I did not understand what was happening, but I knew that it was something bad for my grandparents. My mother and I immediately went to my grandparents' home, and not long after, headed back to my hometown of Przemiatyce. A number of years later, I was explained the significance of that disgraceful scene. I was told that from the end of 1935 until September 1939, picketing in front of Jewish stores was a normal occurrence. After the death of Marshal Pilsudski, Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Armed Forces, in May 1935, anti-Semitism in Poland once again became openly active. Picketing in front of Jewish establishments in small communities and anti-Semitic demonstrations throughout the country was also normal. In 1936, my grandparents were forced to leave the village of Grodzisk after liquidating their general store and practically giving away their new built beautiful house. And they went to live in the Polish capital city of Warsaw, where they remained until September 1939, the beginning of World War II. During the 10 days in September 1939, when the German occupational forces were now in town, all inhabitants were subjected to restrictions, but the Jewish community received special attention. It was during the high holidays that the Germans organized a special assembly of the Jewish community in the main synagogue, where they succeeded to frighten all of us assembled. In June 1941, after the German army invaded Soviet-occupied Poland, being only 7 kilometers from the border, they were in our town almost immediately. Before they were able to establish a permanent administration, they issued an edict for all Jews to observe a citywide curfew. The local anti-Semitic Polish activists became our rulers. And so one day, some of them decided to organize a mock spectacle in the town in the form of a Jewish funeral. The deceased to be buried at a Jewish cemetery was to be a piece of concrete that was taken from a destroyed monument of Vladimir Lenin, a monument that was erected in the center of town during the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland. The starting point of this procession was to begin in the main square facing our residence. The hooligans then went into Jewish homes and dragged out all Jewish men they could find. They were particularly looking for old men with beards. My father and my grandfather were also dragged out of our home and were forced to join the rest of the assembled. As the procession began to move, with a few Jewish men carrying the wooden board with a piece of concrete of the monument leading the procession, the hooligans began to hit them with wooden clubs and metal bars. There were no police to interfere nor stop the disgraceful spectacle. As my mother retold the story years later, she always mentioned that when she looked out our window, she was able to see some of our respected, prominent Christian neighbors standing on their balconies, smiling. It was anti-Semitism in its glowing glory. The procession continued over a narrow bridge and into the Jewish cemetery. Once there, the concrete piece of monument was thrown into the open grave, and the Jewish men were forced to cover it. On the way back to the center of town, the Jews were forced to cross the narrow bridge again, where the hooligans with their pieces of wood and metal made sure to use them on the bodies of the frightened Jews. Some of the younger men defied their orders and crossed the shallow waters of the river instead. Before getting to the center of town, a German patrol car passing our town stopped the hooligans from continuing their projected plan and sent everyone home. The shameful spectacle was the initiative of the Polish anti-Semitism against their Jewish neighbors who lived in this city for the past 400 years. With the establishment of a permanent German administration, the Schutzpolizei, the Reichsprotection Police, became the enforcers of the Nazi racial laws upon the Jewish community of Siemiatyce. They followed the orders issued by the German commander who was head of the administration. The German administration was very strict in enforcing the curfew that was issued before. They also issued an order that Jewish children were prohibited from attending school or having private tutors. Jews, both male and female, who were physically fit were taken to forced labor, some of whom never returned home. The few hours a day that the Jews were allowed outside their homes, they had to have a yellow star pinned on their clothes. A limited quantity of food was provided on rations. What was still permitted was that most of us remained living in our homes until August 1st, 1942. And on August 1st, we were all herded into a new established ghetto in the poorest section of town. They assigned 4 or 5 families in one house, or rather a small hut. By that time, throughout German-occupied Europe, the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of the Jews was in full swing. From June 22nd, 1941, until May the 8th, 1945, in the span of almost 4 years, the Nazi regime of the Third Reich operated a mass murder efficient industry. In Eastern Europe, they brought in the Einsatzgruppen, armed units of Germans and ethnics who volunteered to participate in the operations and the many killing fields. Their mission was to take the Jewish inhabitants from their homes, bring them into an open field outside of town, sometimes near a ravine, and execute them. The largest massacre by the Einsatzgruppen was in Babi Yar in September 1941, outside the Ukrainian city of Kiev. Included in the German murder operation was the creation of ghettos, slave labor camps, concentration camps, and death camps. Almost to the last day of the war, they were all in full operation. It is well known that the success of the Nazi murder operation was allowed to happen because of the silence and the indifference of the Western world that was also infected with the germ of anti-Semitism. Six million Jews were murdered, while the free world, including our own country, Canada, would not allow any Jews to enter our country when an escape route still existed. And I am alive today because my parents and I escaped from our ghetto during the night of November 2nd, 1942, the beginning of the liquidation of our ghetto. And the Jews who remained in the ghetto were put on cattle cars, sent away, and were murdered in the death camp of Treblinka. We then began an odyssey of running and hiding that lasted until the end of July 1944. 6 months after my parents and I were wandering from one hiding place to the next, and sometimes seeking shelter with or without the permission of the owner, we were taken in by a very religious Catholic family by the name of Krinsky, who lived on a farm about 15 kilometers from Przemiatycze. During the 14 months in hiding, we had 5 different hiding places. The last one, underground in a hole, we were cooped up in a bunker and did not see daylight for 7 months. In the beginning of our hiding, there were only 3 of us. When we were liberated on July 22nd, 1944, we were 7. As I said before, I did not see daylight for 7 months, but we were let out of the bunker sometime in the evening when it was dark. A few weeks before we were liberated, outside of the bunker in the evening, we would see the sky towards the east lit up in the color of bright red. We understood that the brighter it got, the closer the fighting of the front was. And the adults would often say that maybe we have a chance to survive and be liberated. They also added that it would be considered an unbelievable miracle, and that for sure some international correspondents as well as movie people would come to the farm to record the incredible miracle. That did not happen. Instead, when we crawled out the bunker, we left immediately so no one of the neighbors would notice us. The wonderful and courageous Krinsky family, who risked their lives to hide us, did not want that their neighbors would find out that they hid Jews during the war. Anti-Semitism in the Polish countryside was very much alive. Even after we were liberated in our town and learned that from our Jewish community of 7,000, less than 70 survived, very few of our Christian neighbors welcomed us with kindness and respect. Most of them were very happy when in April 1945 we left everything behind and never wanted to return. The wonderful Krinsky family preferred to visit us in town instead of taking a chance that their neighbors would find out that they were responsible for saving the lives of 7 Jews. It was 70 years later, in the spring of 2014, that a crew of the National, the CBC television network, traveled with my son Larry and I to Poland and recorded a documentary of the story of my survival. The television crew came with us first to my hometown of Przemiatycze and then to the farm in Krinsky Sobole, where Zygmunt Krinsky, the last surviving member of the wartime Krinsky family, is still living there now with his wife. As I was walking with Zygmunt arm in arm around some of the same barns and stalls still standing from the time of the war, with the television crew following us, I was thinking of my parents, whose prophecy was finally realized. At the same time, I wanted to believe that my parents were watching. They were watching us down below with a happy smile of approval. The documentary film called Reunion was shown on national television network twice in 2 years. In April 1945, after we left Poland, we headed westward, and in May 1948, only the two of us, my mother and I, arrived in Montreal as immigrants. My father died in Italy in December 1945. In Montreal, we were welcomed by my mother's brother and sister who immigrated to Montreal in the late 20s. As soon as my mother started working, she began financially to help the Krinsky family. In her correspondence with the oldest daughter of the family, she strongly suggested that they accept the Medal of the Righteous of the World for their courageous and kindness in helping, in being responsible and saving 7 Jewish human beings during the war. This medal, established by the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem, is still being awarded today. It is being awarded to Gentiles who were instrumental in saving Jewish lives during the Shoah. In spite of the close relationship that my mother developed with Stanislava Krinsky, she was unable to convince her that they accept that prestigious humanitarian award. The fear in anti-Semitism in Poland was very real many years after the war, and hardly any Jews left. After my mother and I assumed my mother's mission, during my first visit to the Krinsky in 1997, I showed the family a copy of the letter that my mother wrote to Yad Vashem, and she never mailed because the Krinskys did not want her to. I returned to Poland a number of times, and every time I made a passionate plea about the medal. It was only in 2011 when I told Zygmunt's son Stanislav that if we don't do it now, tomorrow might be too late. He went to speak to his parents and came back to tell me that they would accept the honor only if it was awarded in the strictest privacy. And so on September 2011, I traveled to Poland, met the Krinsky family at the Israeli embassy in Warsaw, where they were awarded the Medal of the Righteous of the World. The medal was awarded in the presence of only a few people that also included the Canadian ambassador to Poland, Ambassador Costello. Now when I see the Krinskys on my visit to Poland, or when I speak to them on the telephone, they are happy with the outcome. I'm sure that my mother is also happy, and so am I. In the summer of 1944, when my parents and I returned to our town of Siemiatyce, there were no celebration. I was old enough to understand the degree of the horrendous tragedy we suffered. Less than 70 of our town's Jewish community returned to what we once called home. 99%, some of whom were parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, children, and other family members and friends, were murdered in the Shoah. most of them in the death camp of Treblinka. We soon were made aware that it was not our home anymore. We were now stateless, homeless, and had nowhere to go. We soon realized that the hope that we had that anti-Semitism would die with the defeat of Hitler and his henchmen was just an illusion, a pipe dream. Our adopted proclamation of never again, that also included anti-Semitism, remained just a slogan, nothing more. In a speech by the new Secretary General of the United Nations on January 27, 2017, commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Antonio Gutierrez said, and I quote, "The Holocaust was the apex of what we today term anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is always prone to return, and ladies and gentlemen, it has returned. Jews are now facing a lose-lose situation. Anti-Semitism is alive and kicking. We still see the effects of the Holocaust, the attempt to rewrite history. Hatred that begins with Jews never ends with Jews. We need to do more to protect human rights. It will be on the front lines in my fight against anti-Semitism, and the best way to respect the victims of the Holocaust is to fight anti-Semitism and make sure that the victims are never forgotten." End of quotation. And these remarks by the Secretary General of the United Nations were not made in 1933, not in 1936, nor in 1942. They were made in an address to the world in the United Nations in New York City on January the 27th, 2017. Thank you.
Please remember that tomorrow we have day 2 of the conference. We begin at 9 o'clock with Dr. Merabit. She's starting off our day. She's a UN High Commissioner and will be speaking to us on peace and community building. So we start at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and hope to see everybody there, and have a good evening. Thank you.